The Greater Will has always been at the heart of Elden Ring's story, an unknowable force that is responsible for the Elden Ring and is essentially the head of the pantheon in Elden Ring's mythology. The only direct interaction we have with the Greater Will is with its vassals and artifacts, the Elden Ring Marika, the Elden Beast, and the Two Fingers, the latter of which have always been especially interesting, beings that claim to have direct contact with the Greater Will, and it is the Two Fingers that have been guiding humanity for a long time. It is the Two Fingers who guide us to become Elden Lord, and it was the Two Fingers who guided Marika on her rise to power. The Two Fingers have shaped the course of history, and yet for all this, at the conclusion of the base game, we learn very little about them. Thankfully, Shadow of the Erdtree delivered yet another agent of the Greater Will for us to examine, the Mother of Fingers, Metyr. Like the Elden Beast, Metyr was sent to the Lands Between on a shooting star, and her role was seemingly acting as a conduit for its will, able to receive its messages, and then she gave birth to the Two Fingers, who could do the same. This all makes sense until we are hit with a bombshell revelation. Metyr has long been abandoned, and everything we know about the Greater Wills and its vassals is flipped on its head. How can any of the Greater Will's vassals or agents claim to be acting in accordance with its will when no being has had any contact with it for goodness knows how long? Has it abandoned us all? Or has the Greater Will long since ceased to exist? Of course, all of this lore brings us back to the Greater Will itself. What is it? Is it a god? Is it a collapsing star? Or is it the collective consciousness of all life before it was divided? Metyr's lore asks all of these questions, as well as bringing us closer to the truth of the Greater Will, the Elden Ring, and life itself. So join me this week as we evaluate the lore of Metyr, the Fingers, and the Greater Will itself. At the onset of this video, I would like to acknowledge content creator Garrulous Goldmask, who collaborated with me on this video, not only reviewing my script, providing his own original thoughts, but also writing and recording his own segment later on in the video. Goldmask is one of my favourite Elden Ring channels, so please check him out and subscribe to his channel. But before we dive into the secrets of the cosmos, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, Factor. Factor takes the stress out of cooking on those busy nights by providing delicious ready-to-eat meals, all of which are chef prepared, dietitian approved, and ready to eat in 2 minutes. There are options for every diet, with 35 meal choices per week, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, and more. Trade in your store-bought ready meals for Factor gourmet meals that have premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, truffle butter, and asparagus. I'm sure Hornsent would heartily approve, and perhaps he can have something better than his scorpion stew.
What's this? Do you think me in need of alms?
Factor has you covered from morning to night with breakfast, smoothies, small bites, and more that can keep you going no matter your schedule and the time of day. For those interested, Factor are offering Smalltown viewers a great deal. Get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore. The origin of life is something that fascinates humanity endlessly, in real life and in fiction. It is central to the human experience and our understanding of our place in the universe. Elden Ring is no different, and indeed much of the central conflict has us essentially manipulated by forces beyond human ken. We are important to the story, indeed a key agent in it, but we are dwarfed by the cosmic forces with which we meddle. Shadow of the Erdtree really shook up my fundamental understandings of certain lore elements that I took to be truth, such as the Two Fingers being in true contact with the Greater Will, and humanity being a life form distinct from the cosmic. Yet the lore of Ymir, the Fingers, and Metyr add further context to what we know of the origin of life, and how humanity is intimately connected to the greater cosmos. Prior to the DLC, The main source of information we had regarding the beginning of life came from Hyeta, or more specifically, it came from the Eldritch being known as the Three Fingers, who granted Hyeta ineffable knowledge when we touch her with the frenzied flame. In this moment, the power of the outer god of chaos grants her a vision of that original state of life and its division. She says the following:
"All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again."
This is of course in line with certain origin stories shared among cultures across the world. There is an original state of chaos onto which order is imposed by a greater being. The Three Fingers are aware of this original state because it is the shadow and consequence of the new order. It is the manifestation of the desire for that original chaos. This is why the frenzied flame is so potent, even able to affect spirits, not just physical matter. It is a metaphysical force that is set to unmake reality and return it to the original state of chaos, spirits, gods, and all life. But the bare bones of what is said here is that there was once a singular source of all life that was interconnected, and it was known as the One Great. Then the greater will did something, and this life was broken apart and reordered into diverse individual life as we know it. We long knew that glintstone was a material that contained the life essence of the stars, as is stated by one of the foremost primeval sorcerers, Selin. She says the following of the nature of glintstone:
"Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while glintstone contains residual life, and thus the vitality of the stars. It should not be forgotten that glintstone sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein."
With this all in mind, let us now listen to the dialogue of Ymir, a Carian researcher who has looked deeper into the nature of glintstone and the greater will than perhaps anyone else. He says the following of glintstone and the study of life:
"I am a glintstone sorcerer. We study the stars and examine the life therein. Are you familiar with our findings? Long ago, we began as Stardust, born of a great rupture far across the skies. We too are children of the greater will. Is that not divine? Is that not sublime? And yet, none can fathom its implications. Its utter brilliance."
The implications of this statement are quite extraordinary. Ymir describes a great rupture, a burst of energy that results in the creation of all, including ourselves. This is a clear allusion to the Big Bang, a dispersal of energy that was the beginning of all, from stars to humans. Ymir tells us that we too were born from the resultant stardust, and the item beloved Stardust can give us further insight as it reads the following: Count Ymir was known for his recitations. One need only envision the romance of the stars above, with adoration for Stardust in one's heart, to become a great sorcerer. Do so, and you will know love. I find this item description fascinating because it gives a new romantic and philosophical bend to the Carian arts of sorcery and astrology. Sorcery and glintstone study is often portrayed as more scientific, but Ymir's view of the cosmos is certainly coloured by his deep understanding of how intrinsic it is to our own being. The study of the stars is thus the study of our primeval past. Selin's assertion that glintstone contains residual life suggests that one is able to study the life found within the stars, a fragment of the life within the abyss in the palm of your hands. This is now more poignant with the new information provided by Metyr that we too came from stars. Glintstone's study has also been used to connect with the origin point of the life found within it, and now we know that all life comes from the same place. We can assume that the primeval current is not only the source of celestial life, but our life as well. Thus the name primeval current is very appropriate, as it is a point in space from which all life flowed from, the place the One Great was shattered, and the site of the burst of energy that Metyr mentioned. Or at least that is my opinion of what the primeval current is. I think it is literally space, and specifically the point in space from which all life came. It certainly gives more context to the works of Selin, Lusat, and Azur. The latter two have both peered into the depths of the cosmos and witnessed mind-shattering events, which isn't surprising given they have seemed to connect with the primeval source of all life. Perhaps if I hadn't dismissed Selin's ultimate goal as delusion, I might have caught this in the base game. For Selin and her fellow primeval sorcerers are the creators of the Graven Schools, hence her title the Graven Witch, and she too eventually transforms herself into this horrifying amalgam, a very ignoble end for our tutor. We can learn about these creations and the point of them via the Graven School talisman, which reads the following. The primeval current is a forbidden tradition of glintstone sorcery. To those who cleave to its teachings, the act of collecting sorcerers to fashion them into the seeds of stars is but another path of scientific inquiry. They are trying to become stars, and with the base game alone I kind of laughed this off as delusion, but according to Metyr, we come from the same origins as the stars, so this aim of the Graven Witch isn't as ridiculous as it first seemed. She wishes to return to the cosmos from whence we originally came. The suggestion is that the One Great shattered at the behest of the Greater Will, and life spread out from it, dispersing on this wave of energy. Or at least this is what Metyr believes. I recently watched a great video by content creator Eric on the Gate of Divinity, which will be linked below. In this video, Eric said something that resonated with me greatly. The Crucible was once all life blended together, and every disparate life form that has since developed represents a fracture of that original oneness. Eric then goes on to say that the Hornsent have tried to recreate that oneness by pushing life back together, making life more concentrated, as is the case with the jars and the Divine Gateway, and the more concentrated it is, the more the divine power of the Crucible is restored. To Eric, this is why the bodies are used to make up the gateway. The divine power of the Crucible is reassembled and can be injected into a single person, raising them up to godhood. Now, while I am still divided on the true nature of the Gate of Divinity, I agree with Eric's assessment of life. Each of us is a fracture of something that was once greater. This is why the Golden Order fundamentalists' ideas of life are correct. Everything is connected in a chain of causality or relation, if we all ultimately come from the same source. It's just that the Golden Order fundamentalists believe all of life should be ordered according to their views, and that it should be connected through the Erdtree as the ultimate nexus of life and death. With Metyr and Selin's dialogues in mind, we now know that everything was once one. Then, in a burst of energy, it fractured into stars, and then in time, some of the life within the stars would coalesce as mortal beings. Prior to this, I and many others had seen the worship of the Celestial as something entirely divorced from that of the Erdtree belief system, when in fact the roots of Carian beliefs seem to be much closer to the Golden Orders than we first believed. Ymyr's headpiece reads the following. The hat of Count Ymir, High Priest. The circular design at the top represents the Greater Will and its lightless abyss. Though Count Ymir instructed R'hllana in the sorcerous arts, he abandoned his allegiance to the moon. It was merely the closest of the celestial bodies, nothing more. The worship of the Celestial is the worship of the Greater Will, or at least it is one and the same to deep thinkers like Count Ymir. The lightless void is the same language used in the primeval current sorcery, and so when these sorcerers peer into the abyss, they are peering into the greater will's domain, into the source of all life in fact. No wonder they are fearful of what they see. This is the origin of all life, that original catalyst, the heart of the universe. Garrulous Goldmask pointed out some of the key phrasing in Selen's speech to us at the end of her quest, where she implies the connection between the Elden Ring, life, and the greater cosmos.
Do you recall what once I told you? That glintstone is the amber of the cosmos, and sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein. When you become Elden Lord, please illuminate me. Lay bare the secrets of life which course the Elden Ring. Next time, I will be your student.
One of the most interesting conclusions that I take from these new ideas is that Radagon's attempts at reconciling and interconnecting faith and sorcery is not misguided. As Tarnished Archaeologist has long pointed out, Radagon is, in part, inspired by Leonardo da Vinci, a Renaissance man who also blended ideas of science and religion. Radagon isn't wrong to see the links between these two, as we now know that even astrologers ultimately are looking at the greater will's work, just in a more scientific way. The worship of the moon and stars, according to Ymir, is just an extension of the greater will's pantheon. It's just that the greater will is out of reach. Think about it. If everything came from this Big Bang, and we too came from this celestial burst of energy, then so did the moons, meaning they are subjects of the greater will. Whether you believe the greater will is the great collective, the Big Bang, or a more traditional celestial being. I want to wrap up my conclusions of this chapter because there is a lot that we have discussed. The fracturing of the One Great that Hayeta speaks of is likely an event akin to the Big Bang. A singular state of matter shattered and spread itself throughout the cosmos. Ourselves, stars, and everything else all seem to come from this matter, and this is why those like Selen want to become stars. They want to return from where we came. Thus I believe that the primordial current is so named because it allows an insight into the part of deep space where life originated, where this burst of energy took place. The primeval sorcerers who peered into this abyss are essentially peering into the birthplace of life itself, and view cosmic level events of destruction and creation, breaking their mortal minds completely. Additionally, it reveals more about the greater will. I have long argued that the greater will is something different from an outer god, and I believe this further emphasizes the unique status of the greater will, albeit I was wrong in what I thought the greater will was, as I used to liken it more to a traditional monotheistic god, and while I think the new information helps separate the greater will from outer gods, neither do I believe the greater will is a god in the classic sense. But what do I think it is? I know that theorists such as Garrulous Goldmask have suggested, even before the DLC, that the greater will is dead. I now lean this way, and there are some interesting theories around this, and how this could be the case, in light of the new information. For example, I have seen theories on Reddit suggesting that the greater will is a star cluster that has collapsed in on itself, citing the event that Lusat saw as evidence. I do really like this theory, however I do tend to lean another way. As I hinted at earlier when I discussed Eric's video, I lean towards the greater will being just that. The greater will of all interconnected life, a sort of pseudo-sentience that was just a singular being when it was the One Great. It was then dispersed, and perhaps over time that explains why certain beings have lost contact with this greater will. Perhaps as matter dispersed, so too did the greater will fade and individuality took hold. I think the greater will was once all life, a greater sentience that has been broken down in a Big Bang event, fading over time until individuality remained. I think that it broke down slowly, with Metyr being the first daughter of this separation, explaining how it was able to maintain contact with the greater will, which had not yet fully broken apart. I think artifacts like the Elden Beast and Elden Ring are the greatest remainders or concentrations of its power. The Two Fingers have essentially been operating without the Greater Will for a long time, acting in a way they believe the Greater Will would want, but without any direct instruction. We will talk about the Greater Will's absence in the final chapter of this video, but with that said, let us talk about Metyr, and its relation to the Greater Will and life in general. In this chapter, I want to take a brief segue and examine the lore of some early cultures, and review the potential influence that Metyr and other cosmic elements had on them. Additionally, it is my wish to take a look at the mysterious old gods that are mentioned in the DLC in order to examine their potential connections to the cosmic, smithing, the divine towers, the golems, and of course the Two Fingers. We have long known that the Elden Beast is an important vassal of the Greater Will, and it is essentially the avatar of order in the lands between. It is clearly a cosmic being, and given everything we have just discussed about life's origins, this is completely expected. Its remembrance implies that its role here as the Elden Ring was to impose order upon the material realm, and this is indeed the effect of the Elden Ring, as we can alter the very order of things by adding and removing runes. However, in a surprising twist, we have now learned that the Elden Beast was not the first agent of the Greater Will to arrive here. Metyr's remembrance reads the following. The mother of all Two Fingers and Finger Creepers was in turn a magnificently gleaming daughter of the Greater Will, and the first shooting star to fall upon the lands between. Metyr being called the Greater Will's daughter is not insignificant to me. Even beings as important as Marika and the Elden Beast are referred to as vassals. Metyr earning the title, to me, suggests how close she was to the Greater Will. As I suggested earlier, I believe the Greater Will was the collective consciousness of the One Great, that would eventually divide itself into individual beings. I believe that Metyr was one of the first beings to be created from the Greater Will, and is thus its daughter. I find the form that Metyr and her children take very interesting as well, and we do need to ask, why do they take the form of fingers? Well, it is likely because Metyr is like the hand of the ineffable Greater Will. It is via the fingers that the Greater Will, ostensibly at least, interacts with the material world. This gives Metyr some serious importance if she preceded the bearer of the Elden Ring itself, and to understand why Metyr was sent here, we need to analyse her role. In the base game, we already were aware that the Two Fingers were a sort of antenna that could ostensibly commune with the Greater Will, and thus were essentially its mouthpiece on the mortal plane. We should therefore expect that Metyr, as their mother, would also play a role in establishing communication with the Greater Will, and indeed this seems to be true because the Staff of the Great Beyond reads the following. The mother received signs from the Greater Will from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. Lots of really interesting lore there, and it is an item that maybe gives the Albinauric Bloodclot a run for its money as the best lore item in the game. Let's unpack everything that is said here. Firstly, it confirms that Metyr did indeed receive signs from the Greater Will at some stage, so her and her children, the Two Fingers, at one point were truly able to interpret messages from the Greater Will. There is something additional here in the item description, as it says that the Mother of Fingers specifically received these signs from beyond the microcosm. A microcosm is usually used to describe a miniature representation of the universe, and is clearly a reference to the black hole-like rupture that Metyr holds upon her back. I think we can fairly interchange this word with a black hole or wormhole, given the way it behaves when she uses it to summon projectiles from the cosmos, or when it swallows her up at the end of her fight. To me, this microcosm is essentially a rupture in space that connects Metyr to the great beyond. Interestingly, the Elden Beast can also use certain attacks that also seem to manifest a black hole, as if it is also calling its power from the greater cosmos. There is a certain thematic harmony of these two beings being able to create these micro black holes, given black holes are collapsed stars, and both of these beings are themselves falling stars. But if Metyr's role is as a receiver for the Greater Will's messages, then why was she sent to the lands between first? Well, to act as a line of communication to a new world, she is the vanguard for the Greater Will, and was likely able to send back a preliminary report to the Greater Will, a sort of scout's report. I think it is pretty uncontroversial to say that Metyr definitely did have real connection to the Greater Will at some stage, as the Staff of the Great Beyond says she is waiting for another message to come, suggesting that she once received messages. I also think that her possession of the microcosm gave her a more direct line to the Greater Will. I already mentioned the fact that both the Elden Beast and Metyr can summon microcosms, and both seem to do it to unleash some of their more powerful abilities. Again, this is similar to other cosmic beings like Astal and the Onyx Lords, who are both capable of opening dark holes into space in order to pull through meteors. Likewise, I feel Metyr and the Elden Beast are both capable of opening a black hole in space to summon cosmic energies. We see near the end of the base game that the Round Table Two Fingers try to make contact with the Greater Will. After we are denied access to the Erdtree, they stand upright like an antennae, and Enya tells us that it will take potentially thousands of years to make contact.
The fingers remain still, shaken by this turn of events. They are busy consulting the Greater Will. When they are finished, the fingers will again offer their guidance. But thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass.
This is presumably because messages are travelling across the vastness of space, whether that be via radio signals or sound. However, the wording of the Staff of the Great Beyond suggests that Metyr herself was able to contact the Greater Will more efficiently via a wormhole. So Metyr arrived here and established a line of communication between the Greater Will and this new mortal plane, likely preparing it for the Elden Beast and Elden Ring's arrival. However, perhaps the most important thing about Metyr is that she is a mother. Indeed, there is an excellent Reddit post by user NPComplete who claimed that it is Proto-Indo-European for mother. Additionally, if this is true regarding the roots of her name, it reinforces how truly ancient and primordial this being is. As we saw from her remembrance, the Two Fingers and the Finger Creepers are her children. Metyr literally birthed the Two Fingers, and ultimately, they are meant to act as the messengers of God. This important status is clearly what inspired the group known as the Finger Weavers, those dedicated to studying the fingers, and potentially becoming one themselves. The Finger Weaver's cookbook, found at the Finger Weaver's hovel, reads the following: a record of crafting techniques left by a determined student of the Finger Ruins. His brush with the sublime all but shattered his mind, though he was left capable enough to leave these few precious words. The Finger Ruins themselves are interesting, as it is implied that these structures are growths, rather than a construction. For example, we have the Nailstones crafting item, which can be found here, and it reads the following: flake-like stone shard with a faint fingerprint engraving. Material used for crafting items. Found at Finger Ruins. A piece that came loose from the tip of one of the column-like stone fingers that grew at Finger Ruins. These nail formations actually grew here. They weren't sculpted or built by man. It is an alien substance that grows on Earth. For me, it is like a coral, essentially. I also think these growths likely occurred as a result of Metyr's influence or magic, as the form of the Finger Ruins is very similar to the Cherishing Fingers sorcery. The description of this sorcery tells us that these fingers are summoned to protect their mother, so perhaps the Finger Ruins were erected in locations that Metyr once inhabited or nested. Either way, I think these ruins were not constructed but grown, and has alien properties and materials. This is why other natural substances grow from these calcified growths, like the finger mushrooms, the description of which read the following: light pink mushroom resembling a wizened finger, used by those who wish to become fingers to induce hallucinations. They call these mushrooms the stillborn of the Two Fingers. I find it interesting that they are called the stillborn of the Two Fingers, again implying they have a similar origin to the Two Fingers, organically growing from these ruins, and yet ultimately being lesser than a Two Fingers themselves. The hallucinogenic qualities of these mushrooms is also very interesting. Bear in mind these are fungi that are growing from a very alien material found only in the Finger ruins. I imagine consuming such a product would be ill-advised for a terrestrial being, and God knows the effect it would have on your mind and body. I also think that lampreys are beings who have evolved as part of this ecosystem. We learn almost nothing about these weird creatures, aside from the fact they are called lampreys. For example, Glinting Nail reads, "The lampreys that guard the Finger ruins resemble fingers far more than they do humans, and so the Finger Weavers imitated their sorcery. In the real world, lampreys are fish that clearly these enemies are physically based on as well, and it's thought the roots of the name means stone licker. I find this relevant given where they congregate, surrounding these stone ruins, perhaps parasitically feeding on them somehow. This is why there are finger seekers, humans who want to become Two Fingers themselves, as the Two Fingers must be semi-divine to some cultures, and thus it makes sense some might want to become them, and they clearly look to the lampreys for inspiration. Perhaps they believe that these stone lickers have been ingesting the alien fungi, and have transformed as a result. I had initially thought that the lampreys were alien in origin. However, the Glinting Nail consumable states that the lampreys resemble fingers far more than they do humans, and I have to wonder why even compare them to humans if they are completely alien in origin. The wording to me suggests that they were once human and have now transformed into these beings, finger-like creatures that have been warped by this material, though not becoming a true Two Fingers, as they can only be born from Metyr herself. I think further evidence of their human origins can be seen in their visual design as well, as if we look closer at their bodies we can see shreds of clothes, as if they once wore human clothes before it tore and wrapped around them as they transformed. It is little surprise that some of these Finger Weavers would attempt to become Fingers themselves, given how important and semi-divine they are in the time of the Golden Order. I also want to briefly talk about the Finger Birthing Grounds, the unusual location in which we actually face Metyr. Clearly there are some spatial anomalies at play here, as a location this open and wide should not exist deep underground. It of course reminds me of the boss arena that we face the Elden Beast in, both wide expanses that seemingly stretch on forever, despite the spatial constraints of the physical area. So given we have two similar beings in two similar boss arenas, my conclusion is that Metyr and the Elden Beast are affecting the immediate vicinity around them, the cosmic beings that they are. The name Finger Birthing Ground suggests that these are the grounds in which Metyr gives birth to her children, and perhaps these tubes are how she disperses them throughout the lands between. Perhaps they all connect to different points in space, allowing these fairly immobile beings to be delivered to where they need to be. Or perhaps they are communication tubes, so to speak, that give her the ability to communicate to her dispersed children or the greater will itself. In a more abstract sense, I just think they represent Metyr's role as a communication router, but let me know your thoughts on these fascinating objects. With that said, let us speak about the Two Fingers, and their relevance to early civilizations, as it's clear that the Two Fingers would become important to human civilization even before the time of Marika's order. We could assume that the Divine Towers, that act as shrines for Two Fingers, were built by a culture to venerate these messengers. As pointed out to me by Garrulous Gold Mask, these towers were actually called the Towers of Gods in the 1.0 version of the game, potentially confirming that the Two Fingers were seen as gods. One of the longest standing unanswered questions is who built these great towers, and there are some new mysteries introduced into the DLC that may well tie into the history of these towers. One of the most perplexing new item descriptions is that of the ancient meteoric greatsword, which reads the following: one of the treasures of the ruined forges, greatsword of ancient meteoric ore, ending in a sharp point, fashioned from an excavated shard of an arrowhead that once was a part of the old god's arsenal. So lots of interesting details in this item description. The first thing of note is that this sword is of meteoric ore, and thus it is a raw cosmic material, meaning the use of it for tools and weapons likely predated smithing with more complex materials like iron or steel. Another interesting tidbit is that the forge in which you find the ancient meteoric sword is called Starfall Past, just reinforcing the fact that the old god civilization likely saw meteors as an important raw material. Secondly is that while we use it as a sword, it was actually used as an arrowhead by these ancient beings, which of course suggests they were extremely large in size. Given the size, there is really only one in-game being that we have seen that could fit the bill of these old gods, and that's the giant skeletons we find in Caelid and mountaintops of the giants. We have all long wondered who these skeletons were, and I think they could well be the old gods described by this greatsword. They are of an extraordinary size, and certainly could have been considered as gods by early societies. The old gods of the lands between, predating the Erdtree, the Elden Beast, and perhaps even the dragons. I have also always wondered about the Divine Towers, given the architecture of these towers is vastly different from anything built by Farum Azula, or the Lanedale civilizations. Perhaps these old gods were also responsible for their construction. I have previously theorized that either the giants or another unnamed race were the ones who built the stone golems and the divine towers, given the similarities between the forge and these towers, and the prevalence of the golems found around the mountaintops of the giants. Perhaps these old gods are a precursor race to the fire giants. Another potential connection that Garrulus Goldmask pointed out to me is that the divine towers also seem to have meteoric ore embedded in them, and given the old god civilization used it in their weapons, perhaps they also used it in their construction. The ancient meteoric greatsword would have made for a great arrowhead, given its ash of war drags you into its target, like a magnetic effect, which is a common thematic illusion found in meteor and gravity magic, and thus we can assume the weapon art is a consequence of its meteoric nature. However, given that the stone golem arrows also seem to home in on their targets, could their weapons also be made with the same principle and thus have the same creators? Indeed, if one looks at the item description of the golem great arrows, it mentions it is made by a long-gone civilization and is made from a black stone, meteoric black ore perhaps. We have so little concrete evidence about the golems and the divine towers. However, I do believe that it is likely that these old gods were a race of giants who oversaw an ancient culture. This culture likely used the meteoric ore that came with, and likely followed Metyr, and potentially acted as a precursor to the fire giants. The old god culture, as I will call it, likely would have had a humanoid population who would have worshipped these giant beings as gods. Additionally, we have to consider the forges that the ancient meteoric greatsword was found in, as we already know from the hammer item description that smithing originated from the giants. And while I have always believed these giants to be the fire giants, we now cannot ignore this new connection between the old gods, likely giant beings, and smithing. With this in mind, Garrulus Goldmask pointed out that it is also worth looking at the description of Telu's ashes, which reads the following: the spirit of the stalwart stone golem, who launches his own fists as projectiles. Telu was said to be the runt of the litter and the first to stop moving, but it was he who became the guardian deity of smithery. So lots to consider here. Firstly, that this being, found operating the forges we know are likely connected to the old gods, is a golem, again reinforcing the argument I've made that the old god society is behind the creation of the stone golems, the warrior variants and the smithing variants. Secondly, the hammer tells us that smithing used to be considered divine, and we now know this golem became the deity of smithing. Taking all of this together, I conclude that the old god society were the giants who created golems and invented smithing, with it being considered as a divine act, likely because it was invented by these old gods. Garrulous Goldmask then highlighted this culture's potential connection to a more cosmic golem, the Crystallians. The crystal dart item description tells us that these beings were indeed crafted, and who better fits the bill than this old god society? An ancient society with a closer connection to the cosmic, and master of smithing, golems, and building. I think in general we begin to paint a picture of how more ancient societies were closer to the cosmic than the later civilizations, who were more faith-based. All of these early societies and people do seem to have one similarity that I keep noticing: their use of meteor ore instead of iron or metals. The Claymen, the Onyx and Alabaster Lords, and the Old Gods all use meteor in their weapons, and the Divine Towers also have meteors embedded in them, once again implying they were made by an earlier ancient civilization that had great contact with the cosmos and the Two Fingers. I could certainly see Metyr being an important godlike figure in these earlier periods of history, especially if her children are being enshrined in towers and venerated like gods. There is further speculation to be had that could connect Metyr to some other earlier civilizations, specifically the ancient civilization that built old palaces. This suggestion comes from a great Reddit post by user NaMcGrath, who suggests that the bubble sorceries of the Claymen are related to Metyr's microcosm. NaMcGrath draws the parallels between the wording of Great Oracular Bubble and Fleeting Microcosm, how the both seem to produce a bubble-like construct that pulses and then ruptures. Additionally, they point out that the fact that these bubbles were used as an oracular instrument, as if trying to recreate the conditions of Metyr's microcosm, as if they are trying to connect with the greater will. Furthermore, Goldmask pointed out to me that in the 1.0 version of the game, the Great Oracular Bubble was described as a lost, ancient glintstone sorcery, potentially tying it to Ymir's study of glintstone and the greater will. Having looked more closely at the spell itself, I definitely find myself agreeing with NaMcGrath, as up close these bubbles do look like a microcosm. Additionally, there are other connections between the cosmic and the ancient dynasty that may well point to a cosmic influence. As is pointed out in that same Reddit post by NaMcGrath, the ancient dynasty is the location for the greatest concentration of the malformed stars, the grey Astal-like creatures, and their presence suggests a relationship between the dynasty and the cosmic realm. I had long believed that Astel came from the void directly before attacking the Eternal City, and while he may have been originally born there perhaps, he had inhabited this underground region for some time because of the machinations of the ancient dynasty. Additionally, the Claymen oracles use meteoric-tipped harpoons, reinforcing their relationship with beings and items from beyond the terrestrial, especially when you also consider the presence of an Alabaster Lord found in the Lake of Rot, where the dynasty's cloister lay. Of course, none of this is definitive, but I certainly think it is plausible that Metyr and her two-finger children may have had a greater influence on and contact with earlier cultures. I honestly could go on a massive tangent here about the early civilizations, and how they evolved from here, but I do think we are starting to get a better picture of these early civilizations, and if humanity was once Stardust, it then makes sense that the older the civilization, the closer the relation between them and the stars. We are heavily speculating, but if Metyr was the main god of these lands prior to the Elden Beast arriving, then it makes her abandonment by the Greater Will all the more tragic. Another item that we can make from Metyr's remembrance is the Gazing Finger weapon, and its Ash of War is called Kowtower's Resentment, suggesting that Metyr was a loyal and obedient servant to the Greater Will, but was cast aside for the Elden Beast, and thus she is resentful. Keeping all of this in mind, it is therefore extremely interesting when we consider the role that the Two Fingers played in Queen Marika's rise to power and the birth of the Erdtree. At this stage, I have discussed Marika's origins numerous times, but for the sake of completeness, it is probably relevant to discuss one more time. Marika's hometown was revealed to us in the DLC, a now untouched village that is shielded and hidden by the modern Shadow Keep. It is known as the Village of the Shamans. In this Village of the Shamans, we find various direct clues that tell us this was her home. There is the statue of Marika we need to pass through to even get here. There is the presence of the golden braid that names Marika. And of course there is the minor Erdtree incantation that again mentions Queen Marika and her hometown. The shamans were an oppressed underclass during Hornsent rule, as they seem to have been a critical component in the potentate practices, as is evidenced by the Tooth Whip and a dialogue by a certain ghost NPC found at Bonnie Village. Taken together, we learn a number of things. Firstly, that shamans have a special physiology that means their flesh can be used as the glue for these abominations once their flesh has been tenderized by the fetid Tooth Whips. Secondly, the language used by the ghost potentate suggests that the Hornsent very much looked down on the shamans as a lesser race who should have been grateful for this rough treatment. Shamans are clearly a separate race of humanoids from the Hornsent, of what we see of them. They clearly do not have horns upon their head, and they also seem to have a unique relationship with the trees, which is relevant when we consider Marika's Erdtree that would be the foundation of her power much later. We can see that the grandmother of Shaman Village, likely an elder that Marika once sought advice from, has since become a tree following her death, and another corpse of a shaman found in Bonnie Village also seems to be undergoing a similar process. Additionally, I have noticed that in Aner Ilim, there are many trees that seem to be made of people. There is no direct mention of these trees, but my speculation is that these are trees made of shamans forced together and killed by the Hornsent. Bear in mind the Hornsent worship the spiral currents of the Crucible as a spiral tree, and thus, like the jar punishment, I feel these trees could be another Hornsent way of oppressing the shaman people, and devising unique punishments that adhere with their worship of the Crucible. However you interpret these elements, it is clear that the shamans were a different race, who had a relationship with trees, and they suffered under the Hornsent. However, we know at some stage Marika would be elected an Empyrean, as she is described as such in Malekith's remembrance. We know from Ranni's speech about her past that Empyreans are selected by a Two Fingers, and so we must assume Marika must have faced a similar selection process, and indeed there is plenty of evidence in the DLC that also suggests this was the case. Firstly, there is the proximity of the Finger Ruins of Dio to Shaman Village itself, making it almost inevitable that she would come into contact with a Two Finger. There is more direct evidence that the Two Fingers played a critical role in Marika's usurpation of power that can be found in the Cerulean and Crimson Seed +1 talismans, which indeed are found at the Finger Ruins. Their item description reads the following: the Erdtree seed of this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. This age-old artifact also depicts the Two Fingers, perhaps harking back to the birth of the Erdtree. I wonder if Marika's shaman origins, and their relationship to trees, played a role in the new order manifesting as an Erdtree. Perhaps the Two Fingers believed a tree would be an appealing objective for a shaman like Marika, or perhaps it best jives with her existing powers. This description also hints that the Two Fingers might have been the ones to provide Queen Marika with the initial seed from which the Erdtree grew. This subtle lore detail raises a lot of questions about the nature of the Erdtree and the complex motivations of the Fingers. Why do the Two Fingers want to usurp the current order? Perhaps it is just the way of things that every stagnant order must be replaced, and it is for this reason that the Two Fingers assisted Marika. In turn, when Marika's order began to stagnate, the Two Fingers would raise up some new Empyreans, the Gloam-Eyed Queen, who Marika actually defeated with the help of Malekith. Then we have Ranni, and the twins all elected as Empyreans, as the Two Fingers clearly prepared for the collapse of Marika's regime. There has always been a question of the relationship between the Two Fingers and the Erdtree, with both even having their own branches of incantations. To try and untangle this complex relationship, I would now like to invite Garrulous Goldmask to provide his cogitation on the matter.
Thanks to the DLC, we know that Metyr and the Elden Beast spawned two separate and distinct lineages. In fact, the revelation about Metyr turned what I thought was a glitch into a very clever piece of foreshadowing. See, when you first arrive at the Round Table Hold and talk to Corrin, he says this.
I teach incantations, the strength granted us by the Two Fingers, and explore the secrets of the Golden Order, so that one day, if a Tarnished of the Round Table Hold should become Elden Lord, I might counsel them, ensuring order regains its proper form, righting rule over men.
Later on, if you visit the original Round Table Hold in Lane Dell, you can find the Two Fingers prayer book. But if you hand over the prayer book to Corrin, he says this.
That is a work of heresy. Its incantations bear no lineage from the Erdtree.
Since that's the same line of dialogue you get when you hand Corrin almost any other prayer book, I thought this was just a funny glitch or an oversight, or maybe a sly dig at how dogmatic the Golden Order fundamentalists can be. But Corrin does have separate dialogue if you give him the Golden Order Principia.
This is a volume of incantation. It's good to see your enthusiasm. Indeed, I will happily take it off your hands.
Now, if this were just a bug, it would be pretty easy to fix, and since this interaction hasn't been changed in over 2 years, I do think it is intentional, and after playing Shadow of the Erdtree, we do know that the Two Fingers have a completely separate lineage from the Erdtree. Again, Metyr is a magnificently gleaming daughter of the Greater Will, and the first shooting star to fall upon the lands between. Meanwhile, according to the spell Elden Stars, it is said that long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would become the Elden Ring. And Elden Stars is the most ancient of those that derive from the Erdtree, and according to none other than Bandai Namco, the Elden Ring was the source of the Erdtree. So to reiterate, Metyr arrived first in the lands between and spawned the Two Fingers and their incantations, while the Elden Stars carried the Elden Beast, which became the Elden Ring. Now, Corrin calling the Two Fingers a form of heresy may seem a bit odd at first, but this is completely consistent with one of the key themes of the game, that what's considered sacred and blasphemous are arbitrary and fluid. We knew in the base game that the Crucible was once praised and held in high regard, but was later ostracized by Marika and her Golden Order. And in the DLC, the Hornsent met an even worse fate. Of course, with Corrin invoking heresy, we have to mention everyone's favorite dog in the game.
Heresy is not native to the world.
Like so much of the lore in Elden Ring, it turns out that Muriel was being very literal. After all, both the Two Fingers and the Erdtree ultimately came from space, and so they are not truly native to the lands between. Meanwhile, the Two Fingers are effectively using the Tarnished to wage war on the Golden Order. The item descriptions for the various fortification spells offer the Tarnished the following piece of advice. Follow the path that has been set for you, and you will make enemies of all others. The monks, the sorcerers, the ancient dragon knights, and the scions of gold. Heed me, the lands between offers no welcome to the Tarnished. Yet those factions are all a part of Marika's Golden Order. As Rogier tells us,
The battle art you've learned is of the Glintstone family. They were conceived at the Great Academy of Rea Lucaria, to the north of this castle. In the past, they obeyed laws which contravened the Golden Order, or so I'm told. Fascinating, isn't it? That the Golden Order was pliable enough to absorb practices that contradicted itself in the past. With the Order broken, twisted, and in need of repair, such adaptability is more important now than ever.
likewise, after Godwyn the Golden befriended Fortisax, the ancient dragon cult was incorporated into Marika's religion. According to the Gravelstone Seal, the worship of the ancient dragons does not conflict with belief in the Erdtree. After all, this seal and lightning itself are both imbued with gold. In addition, the Scions of Gold consider themselves the true heirs to Marika and the Erdtree. It's also worth pointing out that both Malekith and the Elden Beast deal holy damage, while the two spells that boost holy damage negation, Divine Fortification and Lord's Divine Fortification, are both incantations of the Two Fingers. So I now wonder if the Two Fingers developed those spells so that their champions could counter both Marika's Shadowbound Beast and her Space Whale. Viewing this from another angle, Metyr and the Elden Beast consider the other illegitimate and are seeking to displace them. This sibling rivalry is a thematic parallel to the Shattering War, where demigod brothers and sisters clashed and fought in order to succeed Marika. The DLC might even give us a motive for Metyr. As Smo pointed out earlier, we do know that Metyr feels resentment, and personally I think this was because she was effectively upstaged by the Elden Beast. What's more, the game also heavily implies that the Elden Beast is a much more advanced and intelligent specimen than Metyr. We learn from the gazing finger that Metyr gazes vacantly into the beyond. Vacantly is the key word here, since it implies there's not much going on inside Metyr's head. And if you take a closer look, Metyr doesn't actually have any thumbs, her hands are just two sets of two fingers. Yet the Elden Beast does have opposable thumbs, and just like in all world, having thumbs is a key sign of evolution. According to the item description for the Chenquidea, having 5 fingers is symbolic of the intelligence once granted upon the Beastmen. While today it's left deliberately vague as to who or what exactly granted intelligence to the Beastmen, the 1.0 version explicitly said it was granted by the Greater Will. Of course, while Metyr and the Elden Beast squabble, that does raise the question as to what happened with the Greater Will. And for that, I'll send it back to Smotown. I'm Garrulous Goldmask, and thank you so much, Smo, for having me on.
So I think almost everything we've spoken about really points to how Metyr has been very much left behind by the rule of the Erdtree and the Elden Beast, despite the Two Fingers' potential role in convincing Marika to create the Erdtree. But I think what is more important is what Ymir says about Metyr and the Erdtree.
The conceits, the hypocrisy of the world built upon the Erdtree. The follies of men. Their bitter suffering. Is there no hope for redemption? The answer, sadly, is clear. There never was any hope. They were each of them defective, unhinged from the start. Marika herself, and the fingers that guided her. And this is what troubles me. No matter our efforts, if the roots are rotten, then we have little recourse. Do you recall what I said? That Marika and the fingers that guided her were unsound from the start? Well, the truth lies deeper still. It is their mother who is damaged and unhinged.
This is earth-shattering lore, and it illuminates a truth that some have clearly known for some time. The Greater Will has either abandoned the Two Fingers, or it has ceased to exist entirely. The Two Fingers no longer have the ability to commune with the Greater Will, and those in power are not there because of some divine providence. I think a great observation was made by fellow content creator Cosmos, who pointed out that Lord's Divine Fortification suggests that Gideon also had learned this truth, as it reads, Gideon gained true knowledge after his long exchange with the Two Fingers, discovering all had been broken long ago, that the trembling fingers, bent with age, and the Erdtree itself were no exception. This would certainly explain his irreverence to a lot of things, including burning the Erdtree, which he pragmatically views as something that just needs to be done.
Take no heed of cardinal sin. The Two Fingers lost their purpose a long, long time ago.
Perhaps it also explains his loyalty to Queen Marika. I've mentioned before that I believe Gideon is actually being manipulated by Radagon, but ultimately he believes he is defending Marika's throne against us. Perhaps because he has realised that the Greater Will is gone, he sees Marika and the Elden Beast as the closest thing to gods we have, and thus they should be defended. That is what I believe in the light of Ymir's allegations, that there is no true god beyond the Elden Beast, the outer gods, and those who are currently in power. Marika is god only because she seized power via the Gate of Divinity, and is now the vessel of the powerful Elden Ring. She was guided by beings which claim a tie to a greater divinity, when in fact they do not. The Two Fingers have been pulling the strings of power without the mandate that they claim. It also makes me wonder about the Nox. After all, these are the creators of the Fingerslayer blade. Did they create this blasphemous weapon because they too discovered the truth about the Greater Will, and thus realised the Two Fingers had no legitimacy? As I've argued in prior videos, I believe that the Nox were aware of the nature of Marika's ascension, and they tried to recreate this process to produce their own Lord of Night, which is why there are petrified people in the Eternal Cities that mirror those at Iner Elim. It suggests to me they tried to recreate the Gate of Divinity and raise up their own god, but they failed. Thus is it not very likely that they could also have learned the truth about the Two Fingers, and this was the cause of their rebellion. Other people who may have known this truth are the top tier primeval sorcerers, an idea I first saw suggested by a Reddit user, and that post will be linked below. The suggestion made is that when looking into the primeval current, they not only saw incredible cosmic level examples of creation and destruction, but also saw the truth that the Greater Will is essentially no more. Ymir's claim here is rather extraordinary, and perhaps the reason he knows this is because of his study of finger creepers, Two Fingers, and Metyr ultimately. We mentioned in passing the sorcery known as Fleeting Microcosm. What I didn't highlight was that this is essentially a recreation of Metyr's microcosm. If I am right in assuming that Metyr could use this to somehow connect with the Greater Will directly, then perhaps Ymir knows the fingers are worthless, because he has used Metyr's methods to try and connect with the Greater Will, and upon failing, he has realised that Metyr herself also is incapable of communing with the Greater Will. As I have argued already, this means that at the very least, the Greater Will has abandoned Metyr and the Fingers. But I believe that the Greater Will is actually no more, and this is the true reason behind the communications blackout. Metyr did used to receive messages from the Greater Will, and perhaps the Two Fingers did even after the Greater Will finally ceased to be. After all, it seems as though the Two Fingers received messages across space, and thus messages would take a long time to arrive. Perhaps the Greater Will did send them messages, but by the time they arrived, the Greater Will had long ceased to be. This is an argument actually made by Garrulous Gold Mask in his video that predates the DLC. The idea that the Greater Will had long died, but because of the vast distance of space, its messengers on Earth have not yet received that news, or perhaps by the time they received their last communications from the Greater Will, he was already dead. Of course, I am just speculating on the disappearance of the Greater Will, but either way, Ymir has become aware that the Two Fingers and Metyr no longer have true contact with the Greater Will. Everyone in the lands between, from Empyreans to Tarnished, trust the word of the Two Fingers, as if they are the mouthpiece of the Greater Will. Trust and due reverence is given to them because of this status, and their words are followed because it has legitimacy. But if that is a lie and the Two Fingers are improvising, then the truths of divinity and the world that has been built by their guidance is all built on a lie. The Erdtree, long seen as the vessel of divinity and the Greater Will's word, was created by Marika at the suggestion of the Two Fingers. We the Tarnished are guided by the Two Fingers to become Elden Lord, believing we have been divinely ordained. The Two Fingers even have churches outside of the lands between that serve to spread their word, with zealot confessors, who employ violence in their name. The Two Fingers raise up and empower Empyreans to create a new order when they believe it is time. They are some of the most influential movers and shakers of all time, given respect and power because of their supposed connection to the greater will. It isn't hard to see how characters like Ymir and Gideon come to radical conclusions about what must be done, given the divine hierarchy that everyone worships is built on a complete lie. When Ymir says that the foundations of the Erdtree and Marika's rule is rotten, this is what he is getting at. There was no divine foundation, guidance, or providence behind the Erdtree. The Two Fingers were alone responsible for this. This is their empire, not the greater wills. And if they were the true architects of the Erdtree and the Golden Order, then why should we view Marika's order as divine? Well, Ymir argues that we shouldn't. It is just the design of a broken alien being, who has long been abandoned and left behind. Ymir leaves the fixing of the greater order to Miquella, and we do need to wonder if the two ever had a conversation.
Ever young Miquella saw things for what they were. He knew that his bloodline was tainted, his roots mired in madness. A tragedy if ever there was one. That he would feel compelled to renounce everything when the blame lay squarely with the mother.
If they did, Ymir's revelations would no doubt have just reinforced Miquella's view of the Golden Order, that it needs to be replaced for numerous reasons now. Ymir actually draws an interesting parallel here between Metyr and Marika. It is the sins of these characters, beings who have built our society on a lie, that are to blame. And it is their children who are paying the price of their sins, the Fingers and Miquella respectively, and he clearly has sympathy for both. However, Ymir focused more on the fate of the Fingers themselves, gaining an empathy for the children of Metyr, the Finger Creepers. He even seemingly adopts one as his own, calling it Yuri. He is an aspiring Finger Mother who wishes to replace Metyr. Thus, his whole questline is a way of him essentially guiding us to Metyr, so we can kill her. Once she is dead, Ymir is reborn as a new Finger Mother, adorned in his finger robe which reads the following: "I will be the true mother. My fingers will grant us redemption." Yet in his insanity he attacks us, and there will be no redemption, and the Fingers will be left motherless forevermore. But is Metyr truly dead? When we defeat Metyr, the black hole that she carries upon her back seems to swell and swallow her. Has she been taken back to the place from which she came? Or has she been crushed like a tin can by the immense pressure of the singularity? I leave that for you to decide, but ultimately her influence on this planet has long since passed, and now she has been removed from it entirely. All we are left with is the truth of the world. The greater will has long abandoned this world. All that's left are its vassals, acting in its name and yet clearly pulling the strings of power by their own authority. Perhaps the Two Fingers and even the Elden Beast are ruling in a way in which they believe the greater will would want, interpreting its words from an age long past, despite not having any direct line to it. Perhaps this means they are still legitimate intermediaries, or perhaps you believe it is all a sham. As always, what you decide to do with this new understanding is your choice. Perhaps it is still good enough that the Two Fingers are interpreting the greater will's vision by themselves, and thus you could choose to become Elden Lord anyway. Or perhaps it emboldens your desire to tear down the Golden Order and replace it with something new, given its failures and lack of legitimacy. I think that in many ways Shadow of the Erdtree revealed a lot of uncomfortable truths of the Erdtree's rule. The truth of Marika's ascension, the blood spilled in her name, and the reality of the greater will's absence. Miquella's attempt at usurping this order is almost a natural consequence of these truths, as how could a scion of the royal family accept their rule after all they had learned of its foundation? The greater will is gone, the Golden Order is not divine, and all that matters is power. We the Tarnished have the power, by the end of the game, We are the Kingmaker, and we get to decide what counts as a god. So thank you so much guys, that was my take on Metyr, the Greater Will, and the Two Fingers. I want to once again give a massive thank you to Garrulous Goldmask. It was an absolute pleasure collaborating with him on this video, as I believe he has a real talent for interpreting the deeper meaning of the game's lore. His observations and additions to the script really took it to the next level. Aside from this, on a personal note, I just find Garrulous Goldmask's videos as some of my favourite in the lore space, and it would mean the world to me if you'd consider checking out his channel and subscribing. Another quick note is that this is actually my 200th video on the channel, with over 50 of them being on Elden Ring alone, and I'm really glad that the Metyr video was the 200th video, as it's a really important part of the lore and one of my favourite bits of the DLC. So whether you've watched me for 200 videos or just this one, thank you from the bottom of my heart. But what are your thoughts on Metyr and the revelations contained within her story? Like me, did it turn everything upside down for you? How does it change your perception of the greater story and the endings? Let me know in the comments below and what you'd like me to cover next time, and remember to like and subscribe. But until next time, I will see you in the Finger Ruins. Take care and have a wonderful evening.